If I happen to look the other way and something you need goes walking, I'll assure you burned it, said the foreman and walked off. Once the rumors of his house building had spread among his older colleagues, one or other of them occasionally asked Ove about it. When he knocked up the wall in the living room, a wiry colleague with wonky front teeth, after spending 20 minutes telling Ove what an idiot he was for not knowing better from the start, taught him how to calculate the load bearing parameters. When he laid the floor in the kitchen, a more heavy built colleague, with a missing little finger on one hand, after calling him a plunker 3 dozen times, showed him how to take proper measurements. One afternoon, as he was about to head home at the end of his shift, Ove found a little toolbox full of used tools by his clothes. It came with a note that simply read, "To the puppy." Slowly the house took shape, screw by screw and floorboard by floorboard. No one saw it, of course, but there was no need for anyone to see it. A job well done is a reward in its own right, as his father always used to say. He kept out of the way of his neighbors as much as he could. He knew they didn't like him, and he saw no reason to give them further ammunition. The only exception was an elderly man and his wife who lived next door to Ove. This man was the only one in their whole street who did not wear a tie. Ove had religiously fed the birds every other day since his father died. He only forgot to do it one morning. When the following morning he came out to compensate for his omission, he almost collided headfirst with the old man by the fence under the bird table. His neighbor gave him an insulted glance. He had bird seed in his hands. They did not say anything to one another. Ove merely nodded, and the old man gave him a little nod back. Ove went back into his house, and from that time on made sure he kept to his own days. They never spoke to one another, but one morning, when the older man stepped onto his front step, Ove was painting his fence, and when he was done with that, he also painted the other side of the fence. The older man didn't say anything about it, but when Ove went past his kitchen window in the evening, they nodded at one another. And the next day there was a home-baked apple pie on Ove's front step. Ove had not eaten homemade apple pie since his mother died. Ove received more letters from the council. They became increasingly threatening in their tone, and displeased that he still hadn't contacted them about the sale of his property. In the end, he started throwing the letters away without even opening them. If they wanted his father's house, they could come here and try to take it, the same way Tom had tried to take that wallet from him all those years ago. A few mornings later, Ove walked past the neighbor's house and saw the elderly man feeding the birds in the company of a little boy, a grandchild of his, Ove realized. He watched them surreptitiously through the bedroom window. The way the old man and the boy spoke in low voices with each other, as if they were sharing some great secret. It reminded him of something. That night he had his supper in the stub. A few weeks later, Ove drove home the last nail in his house, and when the sun rose over the horizon, he stood in the garden with his hands shoved into his pockets of his navy trousers, proudly surveying his work. He discovered that he liked houses, maybe mostly because they were understandable. They could be calculated and drawn on paper. They did not leak if they were made watertight. They did not collapse if they were properly supported. Houses were fair. They gave you what you deserved, which unfortunately was more than one could say about people. And so the days went by. Ove went to work and came home and had sausages and spuds. He never felt alone despite his lack of company. Then one Sunday, as Ove was moving some planks, a jovial man with a round face and an ill-fitting suit turned up at his gate. The sweat ran from his forehead, and he asked Ove if there might be a glass of water of the cold variety going spare. Ove saw no reason to deny him this, and while the man drank it by his gate, some small talk passed between them. Or rather, it was mostly the man with the round face who did the talking. It turned out that he was very interested in houses. Apparently, he was in the midst of doing up his own house in another part of town, and somehow the man with the round face managed to invite himself into Ove's kitchen for a cup of coffee. Obviously, Ove was not used to this kind of push behavior, but after an hour-long conversation about house building, he was prepared to admit to himself that it wasn't so unpleasant having a bit of company in the kitchen for a change. Just before the man left, he asked in passing about Ove's house insurance. Ove answered candidly that he'd never given it much thought. His father had not been very interested in insurance policies. The jovial man with the round face was filled with consternation, and he explained to Ove that it would be a veritable catastrophe for him if something happened to the house. After listening carefully to his many admonishments, Ove felt bound to agree with him. He had never given much thought to it until then, which made him feel rather stupid now. The man then asked if he might use the telephone. Ove said that would be fine. It turned out that his guest, grateful for a stranger's hospitality on a hot summer's day, had found a way of repaying his kindness. But it transpired that he actually worked for an insurance company and was able to pull some strings to arrange an excellent quotation for Ove. Ove was skeptical at first. He had asked again about the man's credentials, which he was happy to reiterate. He then spent a considerable amount of time negotiating a better price. "You're a tough businessman," laughed the man with the round face. Ove felt surprisingly proud when he heard this. A tough businessman. The man then glanced at his watch, thanked Ove, and said he'd best be on his way. As he left, he gave Ove a piece of paper with his telephone number and said that he'd very much like to come by another day and have some more coffee and talk some more about house renovation. This was the first time anyone had ever expressed a wish to be Ove's friend. Ove paid the man with the round face the full year's premium in cash. They shook hands. The man with the round face never contacted him again. Ove tried to call him on one occasion, but no one answered. He felt a quick stab of disappointment, but decided not to think about it again. At least when salesmen called from other insurance companies, he was able to say without any bad conscience that he was already insured. And that